Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Opinionated SEO Opinions, where we're going to discuss SEO traffic investigations. I have my hosts with me, Tory Gray and Sam Torres. Hello, ladies.
Hello. Yes, we are so excited to talk about traffic investigations. So you will see it's just the normal three Gray.co company. So we are taking a little bit of a break from having a guest for this month's topic. It's something that's near and dear to us. We talk about it all the time. We work with clients on them all the time. So really wanted to be able to just nerd out about traffic investigations, but don't worry, we'll get back to our regularly scheduled program next month.
Yep.
So
yeah, I would also add SEO investigations are a bit of my baby. You will not be surprised to hear I have lots of opinions about how to do them well, and I'm excited to share them with everybody here.
Everything we've been waiting for. Great. So I will kickstart the episode with our first question. When a website experiences a sudden drop in traffic, what are the first areas to check for potential issues, and why do you look at them?
Great question. I'll kick things off and then let you guys contribute too. But I want to start with the very first thing that I'm going to do is go to Google Search Console. Set it up if it's not set up, and hopefully there'll be some data pouring in there. But in most cases, it is set up. And the first port of call and the first thing I'm checking for is that there's actually a traffic drop, because I can't tell you how often it's actually just that Google Analytics or whatever your analytics suite is just the tracking is broken, and there's not actually a traffic issue at all. So that immediately solves that question. The second thing I'm looking for is just obvious seasonality changes. So, a more junior consultant who sees things dropping off, if they don't know to look back across, the 16-month window that Google Search Console can tell you, you won't necessarily realize, what's the rate of the drop? Is that seasonally appropriate or not? And so that's the number two question that I want to answer. And then the third thing I'm going to do is, it is GSC. It is the closest you're going to get to it for most businesses, first-party data about how Google users are consuming your site, unless you're lucky enough to have like log files and stuff. But I'm going to use that information to really dig into the data about what has changed. So it's not just that traffic is down. You need to ask yourself questions about where is it down? And that is the start of any investigation, right? Which pages are losing traffic? Is it all of them? Is it this particular one? Because I've certainly seen that case where one page had so much traffic that, the site went down 30%, and it's just because this particular page for a core keyword moved in position 2 instead of position 1. And that was 30% of site traffic. And that can be so dramatic. So sometimes it's a one page, sometimes it's a one site section. Maybe your blog, it's not as helpful as you hoped it was, and that's what's losing traffic. Sometimes it's your product pages if you're in e-commerce instead. So you really need to understand the patterns in your data as your first critical thing. Once you've identified that traffic is an issue, where is it an issue, and what are those trends in your data?
Yeah, I would say, just to echo that, I feel like a lot of our investigations, a huge portion of it is spent really just segmenting the data and trying to find where that pattern is. Is it based on, like Tori said, is it based on a certain site section, a certain topic? Is it based on different page templates? Because we've definitely seen that too, where you realize there's a coding issue with this type of page because something happened with the template. So yeah, segmenting your data so that you can identify where those drops are. Because also we've seen on the flip side, maybe a brand or a client is frustrated about a traffic drop, but we find out actually you're no longer ranking for terms that weren't relevant. So it was actually a lot of traffic that frankly didn't really matter for you. And so the thing you can look at is your conversions have stayed the same. Yep. So really looking at more than just the traffic itself, some of the data points around it. Now, obviously, if you're seeing declines in conversions as well, then you want to hop on it absolutely immediately. But for sure, seeing things where it's like brands have letters in their names and you're like, well, you used to be ranking for the search term of T, like just the letter T. Yeah. Guess what? You guys aren't not a great result for that. So yeah, really segmenting the data is where it comes into play. And yeah, GSC is going to be your best friend of where to find those things, so that you can start, once you know where the drop is, then suddenly you actually know where you should be looking and what you're looking at.
Yep. And I'd say notice that we're not immediately jumping into a site audit. We're not immediately jumping in anywhere. Another thing I do is talk to engineering, or whoever is deploying changes on your website, if at all. Because sometimes it's something broken. So if there's something obvious like, hey, your traffic dropped on X day, and PS, we dropped a site change and it went live the day before, like that might be it. So these are some of the initial point of calls of like, where do I want to go to dig into things? And one thing I want to caution you against is finding a thing and saying, Eureka, I found it, and then being done. Your work is not done. You have more to check, because I can't tell you how many times it's 2, 3, 4 plus factors. So for example, we had a client that had a traffic drop issue, and we knew that they had, it was right when Google was dropping, was it FAQ markup or video markup? It was the video markup. And so we know that they dropped because of that. And if we had stopped there and didn't do the math to determine that that was only 5% of the actual drop, we could assume that that was the problem. There's nothing and no further action that we need to take. So it's really important in an investigation to keep going. If you are a detective and you're looking at your traffic, you can't just find your one piece of evidence and then take that person to court, right? To use an analogy like that. You have to investigate all the pieces to really feel confident that you found everything, and therefore that you're fixing everything and you're not wasting time fixing minor issues that are contributing to the issue but aren't the core of the issue.
Absolutely.
That's a great umbrella coverage, I guess. So what are those most often overlooked factors that are contributing to that traffic drop?
Mm-hmm. To broaden it a little, overlooked is obviously a little subjective depending on who's doing the investigation in the company. So to answer some of the obvious things, look at your robots.txt file. Are you blocking your entire site? Look at your meta robots. Are you de-indexing a bunch of pages on accident? Look at your canonicals. Are you accidentally pointing to wrong things? So those are the obvious sort of more technical factors that are the first things when you get to the stage of actually auditing the site that you're going to be looking for. What else do we want to add? What's juicy and overlooked?
Yeah, so for sure, the de-indexing, I cannot tell you. And well, we don't work with WordPress as often anymore as an agency, but the number of times that I have had clients just go into their own WordPress and they click the discourage search engines indexing and don't realize what they're doing. I think I could probably gain back 10 years of my life if that had never happened. But yeah, it's too easy to do sometimes. Yeah, also, we've had issues where engineering created a duplicate domain because of a CDN, right? The entire site was duplicated. Yeah, it's unfortunate. I'd say some of the things, especially if you're looking at your declines and you're seeing them in images, I have seen a lot of misconfiguration, I guess, when it comes to CDNs. Be the culprit for that, which we do generally see with like e-commerce, because the product photography ends up being really important in something, Pinterest and TikTok, things like that definitely support the more visual focused shopping. Other technical factors, definitely, you already mentioned it, Tory, but one of the biggest, I think, is canonicalization. How are things being canonicalized? Does it make sense? Because I also feel like we've had investigations come to us and it's like, I see what you were doing there, but it seems like maybe that was a little bit abusive or it didn't quite make sense. Or like you were trying to game the system and that's not really how that works. I'd say also probably one of the more fun ones that we've run into, and I use fun kind of ironically, had to do with content. So what was happening is it was a documentation website, and the client was using the term XXX to represent any kind of variable in their documentation. And so the site, so what's funny is it was a traffic investigation because suddenly they were getting a ton of impressions, but no clicks. So we actually saw their impressions shoot through the roof, and that's because they started ranking for adult terms that this brand, they're not an adult production company. So that didn't really make sense. Why would people click into that? So that was definitely one of the more interesting investigations we've had of like, oh, what's going on. So I would say also, look at the content too. And this is where really starting to dissect that information, because like the way we found it is that we went into GSC and we were looking at, all right, what terms have we started seeing a lot more impressions for? And then suddenly we're seeing all these things that we're like, what? Why? So knowing kind of those topics or those themes, I think is really paramount for being able to see that, because the content, and Tory, correct me if I'm wrong, but I feel like a lot of times we are seeing that some of the decline or traffic investigations is showing that you're really declining in a specific topic.
Oh yeah.
If it's a technical item, we almost always see it like on an entire page template, but usually what we see is it's in content themes itself.
Yeah, content is, I think, a juicy one that is kind of overlooked. I think people often jump to technical factors when they see a drop, or, algorithm updates, something like that. And, that can be a factor, for example, in the helpful content updates, if Google's not seeing your content as helpful, but that can be a decline over time. Or you could have a technical issue that created duplicate content, but like at mass, and then Google's crawling and wasting a lot of resources on things that just aren't valuable. Or there's a cannibalization issue and like a strategic issue of, whoops, we created the same piece of content 18 times in 18 different ways that all serve the same user need, essentially. And Google isn't sure which one to rank for that term. And that can happen sometimes across like different template types, because you're going after the same user intent and sort of keyword, but in different places and in different ways. Sometimes because you're trying to solve a different user intent, but you're using the same keyword. So you have to be careful about your strategy. But those can be some of the weird, juicy, overlooked factors that people often aren't digging in on. I would also say sometimes Google makes a mistake, and sometimes they fix that, right? Like just because traffic dropped, sometimes you have to stick to your guns, or some other terrible analogy, hopefully, and decide that you think you're doing the right thing and that you are an unintended consequence of a change that Google has made, and that they'll roll it back. A cheesy example here is Google decided one day that meta descriptions should be 300 characters in length, and the entire industry just jumped to go rewrite all their meta descriptions ever. And then 6 months later, some short period of time later, Google said, just kidding, it's back to 150 or ballpark, something around there. And then everyone had to jump and move back. Like Google tests things, Google tries things. They see what the users respond to, and then they act accordingly. So if you feel strongly that you're doing the right thing for your users in the long run, sometimes the right thing to do is just to sit and wait, or to sit and wait and see how the test goes. Right? Like sometimes I'm not going to make any changes for 6 months till I'm confident that Google's going to keep this. And then I'm not going to be throwing out all my old meta descriptions and not keeping them because I assume Google's going to stay. And now I have to rewrite them all again instead of just keeping them. Right?
Yeah, I think, Tori, you also bring up a good point of Google's always testing, and so should we. So there's plenty of times also in these investigations where we'll suggest a fix and suggest it only for a small section, just to make sure that our theory or our hypothesis is correct. Because there is sometimes where it is just like you say with the helpful content update, we saw so many changes. A lot of sites have been declining, frankly, just in the last 18 months, because we see what generative AI is doing to the internet and how Google is struggling with that. So actually a lot of our investigations have been kind of that, are we still doing the right thing? Are we still on the right track? We start having to look at a lot of different factors to make sure that that's true. And, sometimes we are able to find there is this technical issue, or this content is being duplicated, or, hey, you actually have somebody, a company in another country that's just completely ripping off all your content. And that's really unfortunate. So, I think to your point, there's a lot of times that you do just kind of need, and as SEOs, I know all three of us are super passionate about this. You've got to put the user first. Google is absolutely important, or else we wouldn't have jobs, or at least not the jobs that we have right now. But your user, it's all about what's going to make that conversion. Where's the value for the people who are coming to your site and for your customers? That's the ultimate deciding factor. But totally understand if you're not ranking in Google, then it can be really hard to find them. So yeah, I would say we have seen a lot of volatility lately. And so I feel like we're talking about that more often than we have in the past. Because Google's just, there's a lot more internet suddenly for them to consume and understand. And so it's a struggle.
Yeah.
Exactly. And the recent trends and how Google is prioritizing one content over next, or some websites over other industries, is very important as well. We are working with a health website, and they have been covering some recipes, cancer-friendly recipes, and Google's started favoring them for some time. But then after the November update, we saw a sharp decline in their impressions and clicks. And that was just because Google switched again to prioritizing recipe sites over that kind of content, even though it's cancer related. So
yeah,
that's always changing demand. And these kind of offsite factors are kind of like more important sometimes to look at or keep an eye on, because we tend to focus so much on SEO and we forget like the business angle of it. There are also other industry related changes that are affecting the SERPs. And I think a part of our job is kind of be on top of those as well. And with that, have you seen like what kind of importance do you put on offsite factors, or how important are they for you when you're conducting this kind of an audit or check?
They're certainly a critical piece of the puzzle. And if you're focused on yourself and your own website and your own brand so much, you can forget that the world changes around you sometimes. So sometimes it's about your competitors. Sometimes they're sprinting faster and moving faster and improving faster than you are. And you have not, invested in it in the way that you can, because at the end of the day, as we know, SEO is a series of races. Right. And so if they're doing more, better, faster, then you're going to get left behind. That doesn't mean you're doing something wrong. It just means you're not doing it as effectively as them, and you're going to lose the race. Right. So it can be competitors. It can be a sharp decrease in backlinks. So I've seen cases where nothing changed on the site, but these brands happen to lose a bunch of high DA, like just high quality, contextual, relevant links at the same time, or the brand was relatively new and only had one really, really amazing link and then a bunch of, smaller sites. And when you get that 95 DA link from some industry juggernaut that is really vouching for you and voting for your site, and then you don't get that anymore, then that can provide some pain. That means you have less SEO equity flowing to your site and you have less ability to rank. So what can you do about that? Sometimes, we talked about the helpful content update. Google's changing things all the time. They're often deploying that during an algorithm, whether that's the helpful content update, like it might not be themed around that, right? But we've seen different cases. So a recent example from a recent investigation was Google made some changes to what they were ranking locally. So we had a client that was focused on things in an online space, and they stopped ranking for things outside of, because Google was localizing a term, even though the user was adding the word online to their query. So they weren't looking for a local solution. They were looking for an online solution. So right now Google is testing for their vertical more local solutions. We don't know if Google will continue to do that. We don't know if that will serve the user ultimately. So we're waiting for the data to come in on that. But Google changes things all the time. They might change the content. They might add new features. They might remove features. They might add more ads. P.S. When was the last time you went and looked at a real search result? And how much do those ads look like organic listings? And how many ads are on top of your organic listings? Like, so many.
Yeah.
If you're losing traffic and you're still in position 1, maybe that's it. Ooh, another juicy one that made me think of is sometimes the user behavior changes. So we've certainly seen cases where you're losing traffic, not because your keywords are not ranking anymore, not because Google is really changing anything in the SERP, but because less people are looking for it. And that can be seasonal, but I've seen that decline. So we've seen certain like product lines for certain clients where people are just not interested in that variation of that product anymore, or as much as they used to be. And maybe there's new and growing product, complementary product lines that you can be introducing. So staying on top of the industry trends and what your consumers are looking for is another critical piece that has nothing to do with your website and your technical setup.
And I would add to that, Tory, where we're seeing a lot of things like that is especially in the e-commerce space. And if you look at the trend of the search on Google or really just your traditional search engine, and then you look at those trends on Pinterest or TikTok, that's where users are going suddenly to find this information. So just kind of interesting to think, like, if you're seeing a traffic decline, obviously could be problematic. I mean, it probably is. But I'm going to get on my own personal soapbox for a second here, but I think it is time for us as SEOs, like, we have to start thinking outside of Google. We've been so Google centric for so long, but consumers are not. Like, their behavior has shifted. And so
especially in some specific verticals, to your point, a lot in travel, a lot in food content, whether that's a restaurant that they're going to, or a recipe that they want to make. Pinterest and TikTok are coming for you, Google.
Yeah, or unless you're talking about travel and OTAs, then Google's coming for you. Sorry, Travelocity and Expedia, and they now have their own.
That trend started a while ago, though.
It did, but it's really taking off now, and it's really annoying. But
and they don't often have the very good deals.
They really
it's like the ease of access, but
But yeah, I would say that's one of the offset factors to consider too. So I think that's one of the things where we're seeing, like, community management, or like the Reddits and the Quoras of the world are becoming much more important, and areas to look. Because I'd say another offsite factor that we haven't talked about would be the sentiment on sites like Reddit. So is there a subreddit about your brand? We had one client that we found that there was a subreddit completely dedicated to them. It looked like it was them. It wasn't. It was a disgruntled customer who had built this whole thing. And so suddenly there was this subreddit that was completely trashing this brand. Not great. So, that's definitely one of those offsite factors. Or, maybe there's not a subreddit dedicated to your particular brand, but I guarantee you there's subreddits dedicated to your types of products, the functions that your products are being used for, or the services that you offer.
Or someone asks the key question. So we've seen that recently where someone was comparing two competitors and it started ranking for their brand name in position, like anywhere between 2 and 5. It varied because Google's still testing Reddit content, but people are talking about the relative merits of you and your competitor, and you don't hold out great in this answer. That's going to be a challenge for people's, specifically conversions, obviously.
So definitely, there's always going to be people who are naysaying your brand. We can't make everybody happy, but certainly incentivizing your users to be loyal fans and advocate for you, I think is more important than it's been even in the past. Like we saw this happen when social became huge with Facebook and Instagram and all that. The customer and online sentiment became important. It's now even more important because definitely any of the consumer trends reports that we see is that people want to hear from other people and not from brands. And so that's what Reddit and Quora and other such sites give them. And so we need to adapt a little bit and start participating in those conversations, or at the very least be monitoring those conversations.
Yeah. Besides looking at SERPs and kind of being in that industry or doing searches around that topic in multiple platforms, what are the main tools that you go to discover these kind of opportunities or shifts in user behavior?
For user behavior shifts, I'm probably looking to trend tools. So trends.pinterest.com, trends.google.com. You can use typical keyword volume tools. So the SEMrushes and the Ahrefs of the world, and look at like the seasonality graph of what's happening throughout the year.
I think keywordtool.io was a thing. That
they offer some trending
like
too.
Platforms.
If you have budget, BuzzSumo is a great tool for that, for seeing what's going on with topic trends and interest. There's actually a new one that just came out for Reddit. If you want to be able to monitor Reddit, which I thought was pretty cool, it's called Gummy Search. It's a little on the pricey side, so but it's a new tool. It's pretty fun. I'm still just going to use my APIs because I can, but yeah, I'd still say, and I know that we're talking about like what are some of the tools that maybe people haven't started using, but still GSC is always going to be your best source for finding out what's going on with your site.
Yeah, GSC, GSC, GSC.
Yes, all day, every day. Yeah, I'm trying to think what else would we use.
Any sort of keyword ranking data I'm going to want. So whatever your tool is, and hopefully it provides the level of detail that you need. So to use that online example, if they didn't out the gate have a tool that enabled them to track what their ranking was for a particular term in different regions, different cities, different states, et cetera. So they couldn't easily dig into that data. So fortunately, we had some other tools and we deployed that. And we can keep tracking that and we can define what their target markets are, for example. Yeah. But you need the level of detail. Sometimes you need a keyword history, and those tools exist. And they're also pretty pricey if you want history for things that you haven't been tracking. But sometimes you don't need to track it because you used to rank nationwide for a thing and now you don't. So
I'd also say one of the things we use pretty often for being able to see, like, especially when a client comes to us and they're like, my traffic tanked 9 months ago. And it's the first, and so they're coming to us just for an investigation. So we don't already know their site or brand. So I actually use Wayback Machine a lot. Just to understand what content was on here. Did you remove an entire portion of content and you thought Google wouldn't care? Like, we've definitely
Did you remove a link to a specific site section from your homepage? Because that will impact the ranking of that page's ability.
That makes changes. And sometimes we're also able to even use Wayback Machine to understand, was there a technical change, like just looking at the source code. It's less as good, I would say, but certainly that. And then with
big header changes, we've certainly seen that. Like they changed the H1 on the homepage and suddenly it didn't include the target keyword that we were ranking really well from.
Or they just deleted the whole thing. We'll talk about that.
Not bitter or anything.
Now that it's been upsetting. Yeah. I'd also say sometimes if you're using like Screaming Frog or Sitebulb, shout out to Sitebulb, we love that team. Keep a history of crawls. So if you're doing an investigation, especially if you're like in-house or if you're agency and it's a client who's on retainer, like having those crawls, the history of it can be such a lifesaver. Especially if you're always doing your crawls with GSC access, with the GA4 API, like pulling in those metrics at the same time, because then suddenly you have this wealth of historical data that you can do really finite comparison because all the details are already there. Because that can be sometimes some of the hard parts with GSC is you're trying to segment all these different areas and it can be kind of hard. Well, if you've already got all that page level data, it just makes it that much easier. So obviously you don't blow up your storage, but save some crawls.
Because we had that in place for a client who was using Gatsby. And so we were able to see some like sort of declines over time and then a cliff drop. And we were digging into like, when did the issue start? And what we found was Gatsby was creating a bunch of different, I forget what they were, Sam, like variations, small variations that they had deployed, but it was putting them public.
Basically, every time the site was building, which it did a build every night, sometimes the build would fail because other changes were going through and they already knew that and it was fine. But what was happening is that partial build folder was still being saved and still publicly available. So suddenly it was a problem.
Because then that duplicate content added up dramatically over time because those builds.
We had like 18 versions of the homepage. Yeah, it wasn't great, but we recovered. But
the history.
Actually, if you remember, once we corrected that, the recovery was pretty fast.
It was pretty snappy. It was lovely.
So that part was cool.
The comebacks are always fun.
So the things that, and I'm going to call myself out because being a dev myself, but sometimes the problems that we can introduce is wild. So
yeah, exactly. Great. So based on your experience, ladies, what is the best piece of advice that you can give to someone who is trying to, like, who's facing an unexplained traffic drop? To sum up the episode, kind of.
Sure. So I would say definitely segment your data, figure out where the issues are. And then I'm just going to be echoing things we already said, so maybe that's terrible. But yeah, segment your data, find out where it's actually happening and make sure it's actually relevant to you. Because like I say, where we had that brand who was ranking for the letter T, ultimately we could have spent a ton of time and it would have been fruitless because it didn't have a relevant or a business impact, right? And then to Tori's point, don't find one thing and think you're done. Quantify what is the impact of that. And the perfect example was that video snippets issue that we saw ended up being responsible for only 5% of the traffic decline. It was not the culprit. It was not what was going, still something we could shore up and fix, but ultimately not what was impacting the business.
Yeah. Just because that one was juicy, I want to answer what that issue really was. It was, the contributing factor of the video rich snippets, but the primary issue was that for some reason, Google stopped believing their canonicals and was pointing to a canonical variation that had a language variation on the URL. So Google was ignoring their correctly technically set URL, but I believe their sitemap included variations, or there was some other way. Actually, it didn't. Sites just started linking to it.
They had a lot of links
from the New York Times, from these big media sites that just were accidentally. So there was some tipping point and suddenly all these other URL variations were ranking. And so the equity was split across and then they just started tanking. And once they implemented a redirect, because they didn't need that language variation, it was lang equals en and it was already an English site. So it was not a helpful variation like the traffic shot back up. It was super fun and juicy. I love it. It's
one of Tory's favorite tips. hreflang does not solve for duplicate content.
It's true. Making a little SEO internationalization. Fun. But my biggest piece of advice is a big picture piece of advice that is really take your ego out of it. Your ego is not your friend, especially to the extent that this is your own site. If you're working in-house or if you're an agency that has maintained this brand for a while and your panic, your stress, your desire to answer that question quickly in a way that hopefully doesn't make you look bad, is getting in your way of finding the real answer, which PS may have nothing to do with you. It could have been a technical issue that was deployed. It could have been completely external. So trying to step aside and step out of your own way, because I think that panic, that worry, that stress is the thing that leads you to say, Eureka, I found it, when you didn't. Because you're so focused on finding the answer so quickly. You can't be thoughtful and methodical and answering it in the way that it deserves. So do your very best. I get that it's super hard to do. It is a practice skill, but it takes time and it takes research. And I think you'll be surprised how well leadership teams and executive teams will respond effectively to you if your response is not panic. It was them. And instead your answer is, I've thought about this. We've investigated. We've looked at this. It was this and this and this. And here's what we're going to do to fix this. And to be solution focused can really help you.
For sure.
Great advice. Well, I guess that sums up our episode. Any final bits that you want to share? That was quite comprehensive, though.
If you have questions about investigations,
yes.
It's something we specialize in, so we like juicy problems. So
bring us your investigation.
Yes,
we need to tell you more.
We have a whole system. We love it.
We do.
Love it. Great. Thank you so much for everyone for listening, and thank you to my lovely hosts for being here and sharing your expertise. I hope to see you on our next episode.
Bye, y'all.
Thanks for coming.
Bye.